Saturday.
It was once one of America's great industrial centers, East St. Louis, Illinois, whose rise and fall were complex and dramatic. It's not pretty, but it was never pretty. At its peak, this was America's back alley and boiler room. East St. Louis was what the American industrial machine looked like under the hood. And living in the midst of it, the workers and their families.
There were the Croatians and the Ukrainians and the Slovaks and the Poles and the Russians and the...
My family came from the South, like most blacks came from the South.
From its earliest days, it had a national reputation, a cross between Pittsburgh and Dodge City, a wide-open town where you could drink and gamble any time of day or night, a place that you could always find a job.
It was an atmosphere of lawlessness, of corruption, of greed, and the big companies were part of that.
You see tremendous wealth and tremendous poverty. The wealth was private. The poverty was public.
When the smoke of the factories cleared, the buildings were left empty, the problems exposed, flaws that had not just been part of what this city used to be, but in some ways exactly what it was meant to be.
One of the next events on the schedule was the All-America City Parade, which attracted one of the most enthusiastic crowds ever assembled in East St. Louis.
In 1960, it looked like any town USA. This parade down State Street in East St. Louis, Illinois, was celebrating a great honor. It had just been named an All-America City by Look magazine and the National Municipal League. This was a city with neighborhoods, pretty parks, crowded schools, factory jobs, and unions. A city with a strong Eastern European background and a growing African-American population. It was like many big cities, with urban renewal and housing projects and new expressways.
This is a city in transition, a city changing its appearance and changing its attitudes too.
Now, being designated an all-American city was an honor for a community of this size, this magnitude. But what the community didn't know, what the residents didn't know, that this community had been pillaged, if you will, for all it could yield in many ways, that its tax base had been ravaged, and the revenues that a city needs to support itself were no longer flowing into this community.
What happened over the next 10, 15 years would stun, anger, and frustrate these citizens, as their hometown experienced a decline as incredible as its rise just a lifetime before. In 1960, East St. Louis was at the end of an era. This was a place that in many ways had served its purpose, just as it had from its very earliest days. It didn't really start out as a city, but as a place that happened to be across from a city. Captain James Piggott started a ferry operation here in the 1790s, and it became an essential link for those heading west to St. Louis and beyond. This side of the river was a flat, muddy land known as the American Bottoms. There wasn't much here at first, but there were efforts to establish towns with the names of Jacksonville, Washington, Illinois City, East St. Louis, and Illinois Town. Some riverboats started docking here, but it was nothing compared to St. Louis. On this side of the river, there was only so far a town could go.
The east side flooded frequently. It was swampy land, so it really wasn't conducive to development. The American Bottoms, which is that flat terrain of land that extends about 7 or 10 miles north-south and 3 to 5 miles east and west, was constantly subject to flooding conditions, so you didn't have much development there.
It's said that in the Great Flood of 1844, the Mississippi River filled the American bottoms, and that a steamboat actually tied up at the county seat of Belleville, where the bluffs finally rise up. St. Louis had the high ground and became the great river city. East St. Louis's day would come, but it would not arrive by boat. East St. Louis is a railroad town. The first train came here in 1857, but more important than the fact that it came here was that it stopped here. This was the end of the line. Until St. Louis could manage to build a bridge, the Illinois side of the river was as far as the trains would go. The trip would be finished by ferry boat. So it was on the east bank that everything got loaded, unloaded, and warehoused. And the topography, once the biggest drawback, was now an advantage.
Because it's flat land, you had a really nice level plain for laying rail tracks, and rail tracks came through that American bottom from all directions, so you had the whole place was crisscrossed with this complicated web of rail lines, and that made it very attractive for industry because you could find a nice big parcel of land almost anywhere in the American bottom where you had rail facilities nearby.
Within 10 years of that first train pulling in, 10 more railroads would have their terminus here. These were not homegrown frontier businesses. Rail lines were the long, long reach of big corporations with international investors. The owners and decision makers didn't live here. They had never seen this place except on a map.
We are in the mid-19th century, a place where railroads rule. We are starting to see the effects of one side of the country being able to reach across by rail to the other side of the country. We are becoming a networked economy.
So right from the outset, I see not really local decision-making deciding the fortunes of East St. Louis. It was a national decisions of the railroad companies and where would be the best place to place them.
East St. Louis is an incredible city because it is not built by St. Louisans. East St. Louis is built by the great industrial barons of the 19th century.
Even the new bridge into St. Louis came under their control. It was built by local St. Louis interests and opened in 1874. But when the bridge company couldn't make the payments, the Eads Bridge ended up in the hands of New York financier J.P. Morgan. He made a deal with railroad tycoon Jay Gould, and now there was a monopoly, controlling the bridge, rail lines, the ferry operation, and the tolls. St. Louis leaders struggled for decades to loosen the grip of these out-of-town interests. But the founder of East St. Louis embraced them from the start. John Bowman was a German immigrant who had worked as secretary to Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton. He moved to the east side of the river in 1858 and got into the business of real estate and politics. In Springfield, he managed to get the state legislature to grant a new charter that brought together the competing towns near the ferry landing. Illinois Town was what most people called it, but Bowman wiped that name off the map.
And even the name East St. Louis is significant because that was what the railroads called this piece of land. He gives it the industrial title rather than what the local landowners called it. And so Bowman's interests are very, very obvious.
It was John Bowman who in 1872 helped bring one of the first and most important industries to East St. Louis, the stockyards. Investors, many from Chicago and New York, said they would build a nice hotel if the stockyards remained outside the city limits and city control. The deal was made, and the land for the stockyards was purchased from the mayor. John Bowman created East St. Louis and profited from it. But what he couldn't do is bring it under control. There was turmoil at City Hall. From 1870 to 1872, the city changed mayors 7 times, and differences were often settled in the streets.
East St. Louis had a reputation as being a very frontier kind of town. I've heard it described as being worse than Dodge City, a place where corruption was always rampant, where there was political problems with crime. And, you know, we hear about East St. Louis in the news and we think about that community as having these problems today. But they had those problems right from the outset.
The issue that tore the town in two was flood protection. Bowman felt East St. Louis couldn't grow until the problem was fixed. Downtown was low and flat. The new bank had put its first floor above the flood line. Bowman's plan was to raise the streets that high all over downtown. His supporters were dubbed high graders. The opposition low graders saw it as a boondoggle that would benefit business interests and bankrupt the city. It grew into a civil war with 2 competing governments, 2 mayors, 2 city councils, and 2 police forces.
Ultimately, the battle becomes violent. Not only do the police forces start exchanging fire, but over time, the battles become more and more frequent, more and more violent, until in 1885, John Bowman is assassinated.
He was gunned down outside his home. No one was ever arrested for the assassination of the city's founder and first mayor. If the crime was also meant to kill the high-grade movement, it had the opposite effect. In 1887, sympathetic voters elected Mayor Melbourne Stevens, who carried out the street-raising plan and nearly bankrupted the city. You can still see the results of the high graders' victory today, where there are empty lots downtown, well below the level of the streets. And although John Bowman didn't live to see it, East St. Louis became an industrial boom town. It was a city that was raised up in the right place at the right time. This is what fueled the boom. East St. Louis not only had a river, railroads, and land for factories, it also happened to be on the edge of southern Illinois coal country. This is what turned the American Bottoms into one of America's great industrial centers.
This was an important period in history. There was a really significant transformation going on in manufacturing, sometimes known as the Second Industrial Revolution. And what that means is it was a time when industry was relying more on capital than on labor as a source of input. And by relying on coal and steam power, they could build much larger factories, achieve greater economies of scale. And so for the first time, you had these huge, sprawling factories that were capital intensive and extremely dirty, smoky, not the sort of thing that people wanted to have in their backyard.
Getting that coal into St. Louis factories meant paying a toll on every carload that crossed the river. It was cheaper to burn Illinois coal in Illinois. And that was just one of the advantages of putting a factory on the east side of the river, in sight of St. Louis, but out of its jurisdiction.
That corporations don't have to worry about the political clout of the big city. And particularly, they're concerned about any opposition to their environmental practices. They can emit as much smoke as they want, they can discharge as much waste into the waterways that they want, and they don't have to worry about citizen opposition.
On the east side, towns could be created without concerned citizens. following the example of the town of National City, the legal municipality that was home to the stockyards and meat packers and to very few actual residents. Up and down the American bottoms were the small towns with the big factories, refineries, smelters, tanneries, foundries. Adjacent to East St. Louis was National City, and Monsanto, Illinois, later renamed Sauget, home to several chemical and refining plants, and Allerton, short for Aluminum Ore Town. In 1903, the company that became Alcoa opened the country's biggest aluminum processing plant at East St. Louis, but not in East St. Louis. East St. Louis City Hall did not control these industries, but they could control City Hall, and they often did, through payoffs.
The government of East St. Louis is, in one sense, in the employ of industry. Instead of being founded on a social contract where people are in charge, it's as if these cities are founded on business principles, notions of profitability, notions of utility, notions of efficiency, rather than on popular control and benefit of society.
But there were risks in setting yourself apart from your workers' lives and well-being, and other companies used a different approach. In nearby Granite City, a St. Louis company built its new metalworks factory and a whole town to go with it, including homes that workers could buy. It was called civic capitalism, and it too was considered good business in an era of growing labor unrest.
People worry about the labor question because they're afraid that maybe we'll have a socialist party or some kind of radicalism. They all, have some kind of stake in suggesting that capitalism can have a social contract.
U.S. Steel built one of the country's biggest company towns in 1906 in Indiana, just outside Chicago. They called it the city of the century. In a 1913 film, a Polish immigrant joins his brother to work in the safe, modern American steel mill and live out the American dream in Gary, Indiana. He meets the local English teacher, marries her, and raises a family in one of the company-built homes. This was, of course, the company's version of the story, and there were many unskilled workers who could not afford this kind of life. Many of them lived in poverty just outside the city limits, in a neighborhood that was more mining camp than Model City. Still, places like Gary and Granite City could point to the company-built playgrounds, the model schools. And in this film, when the new immigrant heads for a tavern, his brother shows him a better path. In East St. Louis, one of Illinois' largest cities at the time, there was no YMCA. People had tried to get one built, but when they went to the local companies and plant managers, they just couldn't raise the money.
Other communities had large companies, but they invested something in that community. And they became company towns, which have their own problems, obviously. But they took it one step further in East St. Louis and actually stepped back out of the city boundary and basically put nothing in and took everything out and decimated the environment with pollution, etc. And when they were done, they walked away.
In the older, bigger city of St. Louis, the names of the industrial barons, Bush, Mallinckrodt, Danforth, Queenie, can be found on buildings and libraries and charitable foundations. No such tradition grew in East St. Louis. The money that was made there did not stay there. It was not a place you moved to get rich, but it was known as a place you could get a job. That, they had heard, halfway around the world.
I had heard that there were recruiters sent out to towns and villages who would say, if you come to East St. Louis, we guarantee you jobs in the meatpacking industry, we guarantee you housing, we will pay you this much, which is so much more than you've ever made before, and you can come with your friends and relatives and neighbors, and in fact, we'll even ask your priest if he'd like to come over with you.
In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of people from Eastern Europe left their villages and farms and headed to the United States and its factories and cities. The Chuznicka family was part of this migration, leaving behind a hard life in a Polish farming village. Like many of the immigrants, they came first to New York, but they passed right through Ellis Island and kept on going. Their destination was East St. Louis, Illinois, and they knew there would be some kind of work when they got there.
There were plenty of jobs. You had railroads, and they had meat packing. Yeah, but they had work, and they didn't have no union, but they had work.
John Chuznicka grew up in East St. Louis in a neighborhood centered on St. Adalbert's Church and School, where he was taught in Polish and English. It was like that all over town, except that the languages changed from neighborhood to neighborhood.
There were the Croatians and the Ukrainians and the Slovaks and the Poles and the Russians and the, Lithuanians, all the Eastern Europeans you can think of, the Czechs, the Bohemians. They were very much, in my opinion, in little islands, little ethnic islands.
The census listed the faraway birthplaces and the myriad languages spoken by the new residents. East St. Louis's population in 1910 had grown to 65,000, double what it had been 10 years before. This was a city with some 50 factories, 24 railroads. There was work for men, women, and children. These boys had their picture taken as part of a national study of child labor. They worked in the Obernester glass factory in East St. Louis.
And we think of industrialization as the, we associate it with technological progress. And to most people that means, well, you're tending machines, but the need for just brute labor, laborers, goes up by 1,500% in the period from 1890 to 1920. What these large industries need is unskilled labor.
It was hot, hard, and dangerous. These factories were huge operations, many of them processing industries, the middle step between raw material and finished product.
Very narrow profit margins. And because you have a narrow profit margin, you need to run your operation around the clock. And large companies like aluminum ore ran their companies around the clock, had tremendous shifts, thousands of workers, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, keeping aluminum production going.
The meat packers also worked to protect the profit they could extract from every animal. Gustavus Swift was famous for saying he used every part of the pig but the squeal. Philip Armour said that he made no money from the meat of a slaughtered animal. That he sold at a loss. The profit came in selling what was left over, the hides to tanneries, hooves and bones for gelatin, fertilizer, and gallons of lard. On a single steer worth hundreds of dollars, Armour said he made 59 cents profit.
When you have a narrow profit margin, pretty soon all those other costs to do business become very important. How much your taxes are, how much your land acquisition costs are, what your labor costs are. Heaven forbid if your workers want to organize into a union, because that means more expense, and that's coming out of that 59 cents that you're making on that animal.
Anyone who talked about a union or complained about pay or working conditions could be easily replaced, just as long as there was a surplus of workers, a ready supply of replacements. But things began to shift to the workers' advantage because of global events. When war broke out in Europe in 1914, it increased production in American factories even before the U.S. entered the war, but it cut off the flow of immigrant workers.
So, it's a great labor market for workers. Companies, though, they're looking for new surplus labor supply. They want more workers than there are jobs. So you have some recruitment from the rural areas, They try to recruit whites, but their best place to go for cheap, unskilled labor is the South. And black workers there, this is the period of the Great Migration, they want a job very badly, so they are eager, and there's a free railroad ride.
And it was as if the floodgates were open and there was no turning back.
Like the Eastern Europeans before them, African Americans now left home to find work and to start new lives in northern industrial cities. And they heard that if you couldn't get a job in East St. Louis, you couldn't get a job anywhere. There had always been African Americans living in the American bottoms, but their numbers were relatively small until now. You could see it every day at the East St. Louis train station, the new arrivals from the South coming in such numbers that they were becoming more visible in town, in the factories, and in politics. These were loyal Lincoln Republicans anxious to vote, and Republican Party leaders were anxious to get them registered.
It upsets the political balance in the first couple of decades, especially in that second decade. And there's lots of talk, especially in the teens, about voter fraud.
The charges came from the Democrats, and during Woodrow Wilson's 1916 re-election campaign, the Justice Department investigated what was being called colonization, an alleged conspiracy to import blacks to steal elections in northern cities. One story, unsupported by evidence but widely circulated, was a plot to have blacks vote in East St. Louis, then board a train to vote in Springfield, and a third time in Chicago.
If you take the newspapers at face value, you would say the public perception was, oh yes, there was colonization. But when you start digging through the testimonies, people knew it wasn't that at all. Black folks were trickling into the city. World War I opened the floodgates. They were coming anyway for jobs, and the contemporaries knew that.
But people were being told they were here to steal elections. Labor leaders said they were here to steal jobs. And the huge numbers of newcomers were straining the local housing and services. Racial tensions continued to grow. Across the river in St. Louis, there were organizations and committees helping with the settlement of the new arrivals. There was a tradition here of charitable organizations, citizen committees dealing with issues of housing, poverty, and race relations. But the efforts didn't reach into East St. Louis.
I think a city that wasn't corrupt would have had a huge problem in controlling that kind of growth. And given the fact that this was a corrupt city, that it was basically growth that was not managed at all. And it just happened willy-nilly, and it was an atmosphere of lawlessness, of corruption, of greed, and the big companies were part of that.
And yet many East St. Louis boosters saw only greatness ahead. President Taft had come here in 1909 to dedicate the new federal courthouse. The city was building an extensive flood control system, and businessmen said they were laying the foundation of a big city that might rival St. Louis. But shocking events and a congressional investigation would soon expose just how weak this community's foundation really was. No one will ever know for sure how many people were killed in the East St. Louis race riot of 1917. Some of the early reports were exaggerated. The official death toll was 39 blacks and 9 whites. Others accepted the higher number of 100, almost all black. It's not that the country was ever really at peace with itself in this era. There were race riots and labor battles like these in other cities before and after. But what happened in East St. Louis struck a national nerve. The reports of Americans killing Americans came on the same front pages as the reports of American troops in Europe fighting to save democracy. It was labor troubles at the aluminum ore plant that set the tragic events in motion. The company followed its usual practice of bringing in replacement workers to break the strikes and keep the plant in operation. But now many of the replacements were Negroes. There were white replacements too, but strike leaders made blacks the issue and the target.
It becomes so conflated with racial animosity too. It's the way that you can organize people and organize a mob. That's what they did.
In the spring of 1917, the National Guard was brought in to protect the factory and its workers. But everybody knew this was a town on the verge of a race riot. When violence flared up in May, the Guard was able to keep it under control. But East St. Louis hadn't cooled off. Tensions built, fueled by unsubstantiated press reports of Negro crime waves and gun purchases, and by rumors and inflammatory public speeches.
They wanted to drive the blacks out of East St. Louis. They wanted to make East St. Louis an all-white town.
The evening of Sunday, July 1st, a car drove through a Negro neighborhood firing shots as it drove by. Later, when another car approached, shots were fired from the crowd. Maybe some thought it was the same car, but it wasn't. Police officers were in this one, and 2 were killed. When word of what happened spread, white mobs set out to attack blacks. They beat, shot, lynched, even burned to death. Fires were set in black neighborhoods and people were shot as they tried to escape the flames. A family just up from Mississippi stepped right into the middle of it.
And just as we got to 10th Street, where we were standing, we could see different people running and hollering, colored people. And they were getting down in the weeds that they were hiding from, and the guy would run and shoot you. You didn't know what to shoot. You just see the smoke and hear the shot.
That was a scary time.
The daughter of former Mayor Melbourne Stevens was told to stay indoors, and she watched from her bedroom window.
You could hear cars racing by and people yelling and screaming. And I could see all the fires burning, where they'd set fire, you know, to the colored houses. I was petrified.
When it was over, parts of East St. Louis were in ruins. The death toll of blacks would never be accurately determined. They searched for bodies, but so many people couldn't be accounted for. Maybe they had crossed the bridge to St. Louis. Maybe their bodies were somewhere in the river. The nation responded with speeches, editorials, and accusations. Some blamed labor, the police, city government, industry for importing blacks. Some said whites had only acted to prevent a black uprising. In the South, many said the race riot exposed Northern hypocrisy and showed what was really awaiting Southern blacks in northern cities.
By the 19-teens, it was the North's turn to decide on the Negro question. And I see East St. Louis as a harbinger of white supremacy, Northern style.
Despite pressures from blacks and whites to condemn the riot, President Wilson made no statement. But Congress investigated the riot, the crimes, and the city of East St. Louis itself. This wasn't a black eye. This was a self-inflicted wound that would leave an ugly scar if it ever healed at all.
It sort of lets you know, it's an indicator that a city is not just industry. You know, a city is people and a city is social, you know, in the broadest sense of the word. And that social fiber has to be there. Problems are going to be there. Conflict is going to be there. And that's all a part of what our American democracy is about. But for East St. Louis, because it wasn't there, the outcome, the aftermath of the riot was quite different than it was for a Springfield or a Chicago or a Detroit.
From safely across the river, St. Louisans had watched the fires burn. Everybody knew the East Side's reputation for violence and vice, and some knew it firsthand. That had been going on since the frontier days. Even before there was much of a town, the east side of the river had a reputation. There was a sandy area that was covered with trees, and what went on over there, the duels and the cockfights, was out of sight and across the state line. It was called Bloody Island. Many years later, farmers would come to East St. Louis to sell their livestock. They didn't know about Bloody Island, but they knew about Whiskey Chute, a road to the stockyards that was lined with taverns.
The East Side was always a place that provided a sanctuary for all the offensive practices that St. Louis didn't want to deal with, St. Louis wanted to get rid of. So not only was it a place where you could pollute to your heart's desire, it was a place where you could go get a drink on a Sunday. And that's been a tradition on the East Side. It's been a zone of vice. It's been a zone of discard. It's been a nuisance zone.
In 1896, a terrible tornado roared through St. Louis, crossed the river, and cut through East St. Louis. Hundreds were killed, and there was widespread destruction. The very next day, the first establishment to rise from the wreckage on the East St. Louis riverfront was a saloon hammered together from the rubble. East St. Louis was well known for its taverns and its factories, but many of the factories were outside the city limits and didn't pay taxes. The taverns did.
Liquor stores made East St. Louis revenue work. Liquor licenses were very expensive. They had to be renewed quarterly, and they had to be paid a year or more in advance. About half of the city's budget came from saloon licenses in 1917.
This was a resilient part of the economy. After the big flood of 1903, many residents moved out of the hardest hit area just outside downtown, and new businesses moved in. When the water went down, this would become known as the Valley, one of the Midwest's most famous red light districts.
Oh, Lord, yeah. And then when you went across the river on the bridge, you know, and looked out, and the women would all be lined up on the porch. Well, they were just whorehouses, that's all they were.
There was little fear of police crackdown. Plenty of cops and politicians and well-connected landlords were making money on all of this, and prohibition would make it even more profitable. It wasn't until World War II that there was a serious effort to clean up the valley. Nearby Scott Field had one of the highest rates of venereal disease of any base in the country, and the Army threatened to make East St. Louis completely off-limits to its airmen if something wasn't done. But enforcement was always a matter of degree in East St. Louis, and the valley disappeared in name only.
I grew up in that territory, shining shoes, running errands for the Vice girls. All I know is there was a lot of vice going on down there. There was a lot of nightclubs down there, and I mean, there was a lot of hustle and bustle down there at that time.
St. Louis had nightlife, but it also had closing times. So patrons and musicians would head to the east side where the drinks were served and the music played all day and all night. What made East St. Louis notorious would also make it famous in music history. There was live jazz and blues at countless clubs and taverns. And it was here at the Cosmopolitan Club on New Year's Eve of 1952 that Chuck Berry filled in for a sick member of the Sir John Trio, making this one of the legitimate birthplaces of rock and roll. The band was led by piano player Johnny Johnson. He had come to East St. Louis after the war looking for work, but not as a musician.
Then after I really got into music, that's when I really began to appreciate East St. Louis as a music town. I didn't really go there with the intention of making a name for myself as a musician. I went there to work, you know, a 9-to-5 thing.
Before he started making rock and roll records and going on tour, and sometimes even after, Johnny Johnson was like thousands of others, hard at work in the East Side factories, making bricks, glass, steel, chemicals. At one job at the Swift meatpacking plant, his musical career nearly came to an end.
One day I stuck the knife in the sheep's neck, and the knife hit a bone and ricocheted off the bone right through my thumb. And as I say, I didn't even know I was cut until when I got to the end where I would turn the sheep loose, I saw this thing dangling and looking at it with my thumb. All this is white meat up under it. It was there so quick it didn't have time to bleed before I seen it. And then naturally they rushed me over to Barnes Hospital and put me to sleep and sewed it back on.
The meatpacking houses employed thousands of people. Newcomers were given the worst jobs, carcass luggers and gut washers. People spent their whole working lives here, hard physical work in conditions that were too hot, too cold, and both at the same time.
And boy, I don't give a damn how hard you work. You know, you might be sweaty, but you was cold. So, but it was tough. It was tough.
An Illinois guidebook called East St. Louis in 1939, lusty, smoky, and virile. Life in these factory towns was lived with a constant backdrop of smoke and grit from the industrial stacks and the locomotives, and with the sounds of steel on rails and the whistles of trains and factories. It didn't have the big city sophistication of St. Louis, Missouri, or the charm of the farm towns or county seats of southern Illinois. This was the American bottoms, and when the heavy rains came, the water flowed down from the bluffs and collected in the streets. It was said that's how Venice, Illinois, had gotten its name. And there were pockets here of extreme poverty. Down by the river was Carr Island, described by the guidebook as a squatter's settlement with 1,000 Negroes living in huts built from scraps. That's how the Lewis family lived during the Depression.
But you rent the ground for 50 cents a month. And you take any kind of wood you could get, car boxes and anything, and build you up a room on it. And see, we had a room there with no doors and windows. Oh, living in back then was rough. The housing condition was nasty.
Segregation was not the law in Illinois, but it was the practice in this part of the state, in schools and in factories, and in the neighborhoods of East St. Louis, and in Brooklyn, the oldest all-black town in Illinois. Despite the 1917 race riot, blacks had kept coming to East St. Louis to find work. The area's population increased in the middle part of the century, but since 1930 on, it was almost entirely due to the growing black population. And yet in the 1940s, East St. Louis was still more than 80% white. This was still a city of tight-knit white ethnic communities, still a city of old world accents, foods, and customs. But in other ways, especially after the war, younger East St. Louisans would grow up in a very different place than their parents and grandparents had come to. Things were as good as they had ever been, maybe as good as they would ever be.
And I don't think that period should be underestimated at all. It's, you know, that period from the 1930s to the 1950s is one in which people have viable incomes on a yearly basis for the first time.
The factories were still going and filled with workers, and now federal laws recognized their right to organize unions and negotiate contracts. And this tough factory town now became a tough union town.
To the point that by 1950, 80% of workers were organized in East St. Louis. It's probably the highest rate in the United States. And it might actually be one of the highest rates in the world.
Many East St. Louis natives would look back on these days nostalgically and wonder what happened. But it was already happening. East St. Louis was a place of aging factories and high labor costs, and companies were already looking for better places to do business. The biggest factories that had long defined East St. Louis, aluminum, the stockyards, meatpacking, foundries, they were cutting back in the 50s and shutting down and moving out in the 60s and 70s. It would happen in a lot of the industrial cities in what would come to be called America's Rust Belt.
But in East St. Louis, it's wild abandon. It's 50%, between 1950 and 1970, 50% of industrial jobs leave the city. It's an incredible statistic.
At the same time, East St. Louis would have to deal with the old issue of race relations. Blacks had kept coming to the city even though the jobs were starting to leave. The population was spilling over the old boundaries, and an increasingly aggressive civil rights movement was challenging the old rules and restrictions. In the late 50s, James Goss spent a couple of years in the Army, and he noticed the change when he came back home.
When I came back in 1959, things were beginning to change as far as location for blacks. They were coming out of Rush City. They were coming out of Franklin Bottom area where the Casino Queen sits at now. There was a little community down there. They were coming from Fireworks Station. I thought it was really something to go to the Majestic Theater because that was not allowed when I went into the military.
His family had been here since the Depression. His wife's family had come up from Mississippi before the First World War. About the same time, the Chuznicka family had arrived from Poland. Some 60 years later, their descendants became next-door neighbors.
Almost overnight was the demise of those ethnic communities. My father, who couldn't really be accused of being liberal, went around the neighborhood and said, you know, I don't really see why we should move until at least we see these people, like maybe they're actually good neighbors.
I was a bit afraid to move into this neighborhood.
I wasn't. I wasn't scared because my parents and my grandparents, they were always proud people. And they had always taught us that you're not less than anybody, and you have the right to be anywhere that you can afford.
From some, there was open hostility towards the new Negro neighbors. Others gave them the silent treatment. And the white neighbors got together to talk about what they should do.
And the reason I knew that, I wasn't invited to the meetings, but John would tell me, about the meetings. And sometime he would tell me what they were planning and what they didn't want and what they were going to do. And we became very good friends. And I remember the day that he left here. He was the last Caucasian to leave the street.
East St. Louis had long been divided between black and white in its neighborhoods and schools and in its 2 new swimming pools. But it would soon be on its way to becoming an all-black city. Alvin Fields, who served 5 terms as mayor of East St. Louis, decided not to run for re-election in 1971. And that year, the race to replace him was between 2 black candidates. But in many ways, it would still be politics East St. Louis style. Fields had brought blacks into the political machine, and now it would be theirs.
I believe there was more an aspiration to be in the position, and there was a concomitant assumption that things would just continue to work the way they always have worked. And it was not until those seats were occupied that this new leadership began to realize they were ruling over very little.
East St. Louis in the 1970s was declining, but not into obscurity. In 1979, voters elected Carl Officer, at age 27, the youngest mayor in the country, leading one of the most depressed cities in the country. Newspapers and magazines and network television once again made East St. Louis a national story. But in many ways, it was an old story that raised the same baffling questions.
Why doesn't somebody do something about this? And what's sort of ironic is that every mayor in East St. Louis history was a reformer. Every mayor has come in saying, I'm going to make this city better than the mayor before me. There was one fellow who ran, Mayor Chamberlain, in 1915, who said, let's make East St. Louis a little more like home and a little less like hell.
This was one of the country's major industrial and rail centers, built by money, fuel, raw materials, technology, hard work. And yet with all that it had, even in 1920, the city of East St. Louis, Illinois was one of the poorest cities in the United States. And it continued to grow. By 1960, the year it was named an All-America City, the population was 80,000. City planners said it might grow to 100,000 in the next 20 years. But instead, it would fall until less than half the population remained. It would happen across the river in St. Louis and in other big industrial cities. But because of its separation and isolation, the coming urban problems would turn East St. Louis into an inner city with no outer city. Crime, poverty, corruption, pollution, none of that was new. It's just that East St. Louis had always gotten by because of the jobs. It was a place propped up by industries that had, as it turned out, just been passing through.
Aluminum ore, it was a period of 50 years. That's the life of that investment. This is a perfect example of something that's continuing to the present and is problematic for the whole world. The mobility of global capital, but the permanence of communities.
The reasons industry came here were the reasons they left. New sources of fuel, new technology, new sources of cheaper labor in other parts of the country and the world where unions hadn't taken hold, and transportation. Interstate highways and long-haul trucking freed industry from the railroads, and East St. Louis, the great rail terminus, became just another interchange.
It was certainly a boom town, and just as boom towns rise, they fall, and East St. Louis fell. And within the global economy, it has found no niche. It hasn't found anything to replace that industrialization.
Outsiders are struck by the decay and the abandonment. But it's been that way now for a generation, and those who live here tend to see other things. The remnants of the old healthy neighborhoods hanging on and fixing up. Even here and there, an all-new neighborhood. And in a town of boarded-up storefronts, a new place to go shopping. And in a town of empty factories, a new industry. An old industry, really, that is now legal and providing jobs, paying into the city treasury, and attracting visitors. Drops perhaps in a very large bucket, but drops nonetheless. And East St. Louis has always been a place filled with hope for the future, even while it is burdened by its past.
Made in USA is made possible by a grant from the estate of Nancy George, which reminds you to include public television in your will or trust. Additional funding is provided by the Philip Cohn Group and the generous support of the members of KETC.